Sorry about that,
Great.
Jake.
No worries, no worries. So my name is Jacob Putney. I'm the Extension Forester for Baker and Grant counties with OSU Extension Service, and I will be the moderator for our first session. And this is going to be our opening session titled More Than Just Trees. So as Dave mentioned, our theme, Seeing Our Forest Beyond the Trees, really encompasses a lot of different things. And since this meeting really itself is different, being hosted by the executive committee and not a local chapter, we wanted to take a little bit different approach and do something we haven't usually done in our annual meetings. So we want to open that with two speakers, and they're going to cover some topics related to our values and our connection to the forest. So our first speaker is Michael Paul Nelson. He is the Ruth H. Spaniel Chair for Renewable Resources and is a professor of environmental ethics and philosophy at Oregon State University. So Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and please go ahead when you're ready.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate it. And thanks for those opening comments. Thank you all for being here, for the invitation to speak at this event. And really thanks especially for thinking about conversations and topics and disciplines that are commonly left out of forestry, but hopefully I can demonstrate that they're absolutely critical to it, especially as we face an uncertain future. So let me share my screen. So when I think about inclusion and inclusion of other voices and other disciplines, I think that this is not only important as a point of justice, which is how we often talk about inclusion, but I think it's a practical point as well. It's far from obvious that we're going to rise to the challenge of our current environmental crises simply by applying our old and ordinary ways of thinking. It's more likely that the wisdom that we need is contained in the world's diversity, both the cultural diversity of the world and the disciplinary diversity as well. So let me phrase it this way. If we face arguably the greatest challenge in the history of humanity, and if that requires the full power and force of the human imagination, and if that imagination is contained within our cultures and our disciplines, then exclusion of that diversity is not only unjust, but it's foolish and dangerous as well. So my background is in philosophy. I'm trained as a philosopher, but I've worked my entire career, pretty much my entire career, kind of within conservation and natural resources. So at Oregon State, I'm squarely in the College of Forestry. So I want to focus my comments, and I want to think about the future. I want to think about the uncertain future, doing our work in a time of change. These are the ideas that have been on my mind a lot lately. And I want to think about what an uncertain future asks of us, or I would say maybe demands of us, and how that might be different than what we've thought about forestry and done in forestry and approached the ways we've approached forestry in the past. One reason to focus on the future is that the world has been changing around us in ways that we might not appreciate in the sense of being aware of. It seems that even from within the dominant Western worldview, we are seeing profound value shifts with regard to the way that people value nature. And it's something I think we need to really be attending. And I'm just going to share a little research from some colleagues. They've done this sort of longitudinal study over time, really trying to understand the way that people think about and value nature, specifically in this case, wildlife. And so they have this spectrum that goes from the kind of domination attitude toward nature, right, that emphasizes the use of animals for human material benefit, to what they call mutualism, which reflects a much more egalitarian idea about the role of animals in our moral community. And what they've discovered is that over time, these values are shifting, and they're shifting pretty profoundly. We are moving quickly away from a dominionistic attitude toward wildlife, toward nature. I think you can abstract this outward probably, and much more toward a mutualistic attitude about nature. And you can see it in these, if you look at the x-axis here, it's generations. There are some profound generational shifts that we're seeing. And if we ask why, it's actually hard to answer that question, why. It seems like a little bit of it has to do with education, maybe a little bit of it has to do with income. The authors claim that a lot of it has to do with urbanization, although exactly what the mechanism of urbanization is that makes somebody more morally inclusive is sort of unclear. But I think we need to be aware of this, that the value world around us is changing, which means that we could quickly look outmoded or irrelevant. So that's a kind of context that I want to think about. If I had one thing that I wanted you to take away from my comments, one take-home message, it would be this, or kind of a lesson or a tool or a skill to think about. And I guess the take-home is that science is only part of management. Science is only part of how we decide what we ought to do. And this is not a cliche or quotation. It's just a matter of logic, actually. You have to articulate values as well. So a syllogism, I'm a philosopher, so I deal with arguments, and a kind of argument is called a syllogism. Syllogism is two premises leading to one conclusion, right? P's are premises here and C is the conclusion. That's just what we think of as a syllogism. If you have a conclusion that prompts an action that suggests that we ought to do something or we should do something, which is so much of what we do in natural resource management and conservation, we're making proposals for actions. That's known as the practical syllogism. You're trying to arrive at a practical conclusion, a prescriptive conclusion. So as a matter of logic, you will have to have two kinds of premises. You will have to have descriptive empirical premises. This is the way the world is. This is the way the world might be in the future. If we do this, this might happen. If we do that, something else might happen. But you have to also have normative or ethical or value premises. This is what we value. This is what we think is important. This is how the world ought to be. You have to bring these two together somehow to arrive at a prescriptive conclusion. So all of these questions on the right here are illustrations, right? They all start with the word should. Ought, should. These are the sort of burning questions in front of us, and they all sort of can be dealt with or thought of with regard to the practical syllogism, and they can actually be systematically worked on in this way as well. This is one of the things I do in the classes I teach in critical thinking, is teach students, how do you actually lay out arguments and analyze arguments. This approach, if one ignores it, if one thinks that you can just go from science to conclusions about what we ought to do, you're probably going to commit one of two fallacies, and they're actually related fallacies. You're either going to commit the is-ought fallacy, which is just trying to derive a prescription for action from facts alone. And this is something we do really regularly in conservation. It's almost like an addiction, actually. Or you're gonna commit a variety of this fallacy known as the naturalistic fallacy, where you try to justify a course of action based on what you assume is the naturalness of the action, which is also it's a descriptive. It's an is. This is natural, therefore this is ought to be. So ignoring the practical syllogism forces you into sort of fallacious kinds of reasoning. So we see this in natural resources when we talk about things like, we're trying to replicate something, historic range of variation, replicating natural conditions. We're flirting with the naturalistic fallacy when we're justifying our actions that way. And most likely we probably mean something else by that. So there's probably ways to get around this, but we sometimes fall into this trap. Kathleen Dean Moore and I realized that this was going on in the climate conversation about a decade ago, that climate scientists were trying to go from descriptions about the condition of the world, right? This is what climate change is going to bring, to trying to prompt actions, whether they be legislation or management actions. And we realized that nothing was happening as a result, and even as they redoubled their efforts, nothing was happening. So what we did is we reached out to about 100 of the world's moral leaders and asked them some version of a question like, is it wrong to wreck the world? And why? And can you tell us in about 1,500 words or less? So we put those essays together in the book, Moral Ground. And the conversation has changed since that time. I'm claiming no causal relationship between our book and the conversation, but the climate conversation in many arenas has become much more a conversation about ethics and values than it was prior to our book. So there's a correlation, at least, between the book and that conversation. So another thing that philosophers do, in addition to thinking about arguments and analyzing arguments, is that we analyze concepts. We could even say that philosophy is the study of concepts. And natural resources disciplines are filled with concepts, many of which are under-analyzed, some of which then cause problems for us. So sustainability, restoration, endangered and threatened within something like the Endangered Species Act, natural regeneration, ecosystem management, ecological forestry. These things are all concepts as much as they are anything else. And so I want to pick just one concept that seems to be on our minds a lot currently that I think merits some kind of attention. And I want to pick the concept of recovery, especially with regard to recent wildfires that we've all experienced. So for me, the 2020 fires became philosophically and ethically interesting when we started to talk about recovery from fire. Recovery is a concept, and as I said, philosophers analyze concepts. That's our jam. What we think about something like a fire or nearly anything really depends upon what we think about ourselves and the world around us in the first place. So our concepts betray more fundamental ideas about what we think human beings are and what we think the rest of the world is and what we think the appropriate relationship between them ought to be. So it depends on our worldview, is a word that we could use to describe our ideas about ourselves and nature and the relationship between them. So what we think recovery is like it's filtered through that lens of a worldview, and we ultimately judge our actions according to that. So recovery betrays a lot about our worldview. It tells us a lot about how we think about the world around us. And it's certainly the case in the language that we use in ecology. If we just consider the etymology of the word recovery, it comes to us from Latin, then Old French, and it finds its way into English. And it means to return to re-obtain or resume in reference to like a given state of mind or body, among other related words. I think a relevant definition for us this morning might be to regain a former or better state or condition. We say the city soon recovered from the effects of the earthquake. We say, will Aunt Mary recover fully from her stroke? Or my uncle is a recovering alcoholic. Or in the case at hand, how and when will a forest recover from fires? But in all its meanings, recover presupposes a natural, normal, healthy, or good state, which is then disrupted somehow by some harm, or as we try to neutralize and value sanitize things in ecology, the natural state is impacted by some change. And this occurrence disrupted that preferred state, that better state. And what was harmed or changed is now working to get back to that former state. And we are possibly helping or at least cheering on nature to return to that former state. Nothing I'm saying I don't think is out of the way we normally think of, out of the realm of the way we normally think of recovery. So to the degree that something returns to that previous state, we say it's recovered. It's made whole again, is another way to talk about recovery. Now, interestingly, when we're often not pointing at the same quality of a thing, like an ecosystem, for instance, when we assert or evaluate it as recovered. Sometimes we're pointing to its appearance, the way it looks. Sometimes, it looks the way that it did before, or nearly the same as it did before. And sometimes we're pointing to its function. The forest is still doing the same things as it did before. Sometimes we're simply pointing to its continued existence or living in some way. Look at all the new plants coming into the burned area, we say. It's recovering, ain't nature grand. And it's an interesting word too, recovery, because it's what we might call a thick descriptor. It's a word that not only describes some feature some reality or some supposedly objective condition in the world, but it's one that's also value laden at the same time. And in this case, it's positively value laden. We think of recovery as a good thing. And it's a lot like health, the word health in that way. Both it's a description and it's seen as a positive thing, a good thing. And in fact, actually, it's a lot like health because we're taking a word that evolved mainly to apply to humans and human health, and we're applying it to a different realm. In this case, we're applying it to nature, or more specifically to ecosystems in most cases, or at least those that have burned. And when we do this, sometimes when we use things in this metaphorical way, we can get confused with the real meaning or the real application. The metaphor can become the reality, and that can create some confusions for us. So one way to try to make sense of this is to think a little bit about the history of ecology. So ecology as a discipline has an interesting, not just a temporal history, but an intellectual history as well. To think about fire through that intellectual history and the idea of what does it mean, according to that history, to recover from fire. If you are at all a student of the history of ecology, you realize that ecology often explains nature in metaphorical terms. In fact, ecology might be viewed as a science engaged in a 100-year search for just the right metaphor to describe nature. It's interesting to consider fire and recovery in the light of what I think are, I would say, the four dominant modes of ecological thought, the four dominant ecological metaphors over the past 100 years or so. So I just want to trace those quickly and wonder what recovery means according to these paradigms, these ideas in ecology. So in the 1920s, ecologist Frederick Clements offered us a metaphor for nature. He offered us what's sometimes called the superorganismic model of nature. Nature was, for Clements, like a superorganism. That is to say, it's like a giant organism with giant systems of regulation and homeostasis. A fire, even a large one in this model, might be seen as a minimal disturbance, a flare-up, a blemish in comparison to a superorganism. So the superorganism is relatively unharmed even by what we think of as a massive fire. Therefore, the fire is easy to recover from. But it's not clear that you cannot also apply that metaphor to a forest itself or to a forest ecosystem itself. Which means that a large fire could be viewed as a harm to the superorganism if the ecosystem is the superorganism as opposed to the entire planet. And therefore something that would be recovered from it would make sense to say that you could recover from it. So in short, it's hard to make sense of a large fire when you think in these purely Clementian terms, because it's not exactly clear at what scale the superorganismic metaphor applies. Does it apply to nature as a whole, the planet as a whole, or to smaller scales, to things that we call ecosystems, or does it apply to all of those things at the same time? So it's hard to get very far, I think, with this. So in the 1930s, Charles Elton proposed that nature was really like a community. It wasn't a superorganism, it was like a community, and specifically, it was like an economic community where everything plays a role, either as a producer, right? Think green plants, a consumer, think animals, or a decomposer, think bacteria and fungi. And in this economic metaphor, nature's economy, to do harm to nature is to disrupt or to unbalance the proportions of those three economic roles. So here fire might be viewed as harmful because it temporarily unbalances the economy of nature. And recovery is the trajectory toward a rebalancing of that economy. We already have another metaphor creeping into my language here, the notion of balance, which is also used quite regularly when we think of ecology. But here, a different trajectory of the forest set in motion by the fire might not be seen as a bad thing, since it's really about something, maybe anything, occupying the role of producer, consumer, and decomposer. So like the superorganismic model, it's not obvious that this model of nature, this metaphor of nature, allows us to think in any way definitively about fire and the notion of recovery from fire. Other things can occupy these roles. How much imbalance is enough to say that we've disrupted the system? These are not easily answerable questions. In 1935, so shortly after Elton, right, we have these competing paradigms kind of at the same time in many ways. In the search to make ecology more quantifiable, ecology was trying to come of age. What it means to come of age in a science is to be more quantifiable. Arthur Tansley and Ray Linneman coined the term ecosystem. So this is where we get the notion of an ecosystem. This is a way to describe nature and the workings of nature. They give us what is sometimes referred to as the hydrologic metaphor. But instead of water flowing in a system, we have energy flowing in a system. And energy can be traced, it can be quantified, it can be measured. We can have food webs that are essentially exchanges of energy as the fundamental structure of nature. So in this view, a forest is a certain kind of energy network, and recovery is the regaining of the energy network that existed previously. Here, however, it's difficult to make sense of a disturbance like fire and the notion of recovery. Does it have to be the same energy network? Can it be any energy network? Is it not a harm and therefore not in need of recovery as long as energy continues to flow in some way? Will it continue to flow inevitably? I think the point is it's simply not clear. It's simply not clear that we can take this metaphor and make real clear sense out of fire and the notion of recovery. So the last metaphor comes in the 1980s. Ecologist Dan Botkin and others began talking more and more about disturbance as the norm of nature. Stasis doesn't exist in nature in this metaphor. And the harmony we look for is at very best an incredibly discordant harmony. Constant change at various scales is normal, is the background noise of nature. So if what is good or healthy or desired is what is natural, and if what is natural is disturbance and change, a fire at any scale is not only normal and natural, but it's good and healthy as well. So it's difficult to make sense of the notion of recovery here because it seems to run contrary to the notion of one disturbance just folding into another disturbance. So in short, I don't think that our current ways of thinking about nature, ourselves, our relationship with nature as they are epitomized in ecology allows us to make a tremendous amount of sense of the notion of recovery from fire. And I think there's good reason for that, more in a minute. I think we possibly need entirely different ways to think about this relationship and the idea of recovery from fire. So there's another way, I think, to see a connection between science and ethics and therefore prescriptions for action. I want to come at this in a different way. So until last month, I served as the lead principal investigator for the H.J. Andrews Forest Long-Term Ecological Research Program. So this is a large and diverse research program. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. It's been working to understand old growth forests for more than 40 years, 42 years to be exact. We started in 1980. A dominant feature of our long-term work falls, for me, under the heading of surprise. After a few years, what I started seeing was the dominant feature of so much of our work was this notion of surprise. This, I think, for me, is a forest that's full of surprises. And these surprises seem to come in two types. Type one are surprises of just amazement about how our system works when we pay attention to it carefully and over time. And type two surprises are where we thought something was going to be one way, and it turned out to be different than that. Or a theory suggests this is how nature works, this is how a forest works. And over time, it doesn't work that way. Over time, we see something quite different. So for me, the surprises that have been uncovered over time fall into these two categories. And I want to just illustrate this with one study at the Andrews Forest. There are, I think, around 100 studies going on at any one time, but this is just one of them. So I want to focus on the signature program of our project of our program, our long-term log decomposition study. So in this study, large quantities of logs were laid down in the forest in 1985 to study the process of decomposition. How does it work? What actually happens as logs decompose? And it was estimated at that time that some logs, depending on the species, could take up to 200 years to decompose. So it was actually set up as a 200-year study, which is an unbelievably audacious thing to set out to do. So after 35 years, here I want to just share 3 of the most interesting surprises that we've seen. These were shared to me by the person leading this program, Mark Harmon. So first, one of the more surprising findings is how the presence of logs, one might say, forces the forest floor upward. That is, the organic layer of the soil moves upwards. The reason is really simple, as Mark explains. It turns out that logs are solid objects, and that blocks the flow of litter in the form of leaves, twigs, and cones from reaching the soil surface. And we found over the course of 30 years that the forest floor beneath the log actually sort of disappears. It's just gone and exposes the mineral soil surface. Where did it go? Well, we found it on top of the log. That meant that the forest floor migrated upward about 50 centimeters over the course of the experiment. We had not considered before that a forest floor could move, let alone levitate. Obviously, it's not the same soil that forms on the top of the log, but we do see this sort of change in positioning in the forest. Second example, in science, we like to quantify things. And when you do that for living versus dead trees, you come to a really startling conclusion that dead trees have more living cell mass than live trees. Dead trees they also contain more forms of life than live trees. And it raises the question, what does it even mean to be alive, actually? That's a different talk entirely. So if we tally up the living cells in a live tree, we find that while leaves and small roots are largely alive, most of the rest of the tree, such as the outer bark, the heartwood, and sapwood are not. And as a rough estimate, a living Douglas fir is about 8 to 10% living cell mass. In contrast, a dead Douglas fir in the middle stages of decomposition is between 12 and 22% living cell mass. And in terms of life forms, it's not even close. While the Douglas fir has potentially many species of lichens and moss living on it and fungi growing within its roots, there are likely thousands of species in the form of bacteria, fungi, insects, and other related groups, nematodes and protozoa, using dead trees as home and a food source. And finally, research on the rate that dead trees release carbon back into the atmosphere has found just tremendous variation related to the species of tree. In the Pacific Northwest, measurements indicate this release of carbon could take as little as 35 years to as many as 800 years, we now think. So we were actually pretty tame in our idea that this would be a 200-year study. It's more likely to be an 800-year study. So that number has some important implications, perhaps. First, because it takes decades to centuries for this carbon to be released, dead trees can accumulate and store carbon in forests. Second, because there's such a large degree of variation, we could vary the amount of carbon stored in a forest up to 20-fold by just manipulating the species that are present. So surprise, amazement, wonder, these are not only powerful scientific discoveries, but I think they're normatively, ethically loaded as well. They carry value and ethical implications with them. They are, in some ways, another example of what I call the fifth perspective. First, surprise, amazement, wonder. When we hear stories like this, they evoke a response in us. And that response is really simple, but it's also really powerful. And that response is wow, or some version of wow. And wow, as simple as it is deeply value-laden and deeply positively value-laden. We seldom go from wow, that's amazing, to we should destroy that. It's in fact quite the opposite. And second, in general, what we often see in our work are theories that assume or predict more homogeneity in time and space than is really there, or that is seen when we look at something over time, over the long haul. And the result of that, the result of seeing these surprises over and over and over again, is not only surprise, but I think humility. And humility is an ethical response. It's a virtue, it's a character trait. And it's the opposite of humility, which arguably sits at the core of our environmental problems. Ecologists sometimes speak of a system being limited by some element, that some element like light or nutrients or temperature seems to unusually throttle a system. And I think we might also say that human systems, and especially the human relationship to nature, is marked by certain limitations as well. And many have argued that the current system is earmarked by a lack of humility, that the human-nature relationship, that is humility limited. If so, then the ability of science to contribute humility to a humility-limited system through its findings might arguably be one of the greatest contributions that science could actually make, telling scientific stories that make us go, wow. I think when I think about the connection between science and ethics and management, which I've been sort of touching on over and over here, I keep thinking that we have to get better at this. We have to get better at seeing the roots of our problems and our challenges. How deep are they? Not just historically, but how deep are they in our worldviews? Where do they actually come from? That's one thing I think the future demands of us, that we get better at seeing those fusions of including these other voices. Fossil fuel addiction, massive fires, climate change, biodiversity loss, these are moral crises as much as they are anything else. We face a philosophical crisis, a moral crisis, and we need all of the moral rallying points that we can muster, and I've given you a few today. Art can serve that function. Art can be a moral rallying point. Science can serve that function. Philosophy can serve that function. The spaces between our disciplines can serve that function, or they cannot serve that function. They can serve some other function. All of our disciplines, and again, the spaces between them, can prompt our imaginations, can prompt our conversations, prompting our thoughts about what kind of people we will be, what kind of world we will bring forth, prompting not just reflecting new ways of life on this bruised and blessed earth. I want to end, I want to close out here with just a very short reading from a writer that I'm particularly fond of at the moment. He's from Ohio. His name is Jared Anderson. And I think he offers some really nice advice for what I would call like the fluidness of mind that the future demands of us, asks of us. And he puts it this way. He says, as forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It is not an age for stone towers. It is an age for stubborn flowers. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we have a few minutes here for questions. I haven't seen anything pop up in the Q&A box, but does anybody have any questions? Well, I have one then. So what are some different factors that influence a person's view or values when it comes to nature? I know you, at the beginning, you mentioned the wildlife and education and urbanization, but what are some other factors that influence those?
I'm not sure we know entirely. There was another study that I was a part of where we were trying to assess whether or not people were willing to attribute what we call intrinsic value to nature, or to wildlife in this case, that you know it's worthy of respect on its own, quite apart from what it does for human beings. How willing are people to think about wildlife in that way? And we, you know, when we do surveys like that, we also are collecting demographic data, all different kinds of demographic data, and none of the demographic measurements tell us very much. The thing that was most surprising about that study was that this was done in Ohio and then it was replicated nationwide, is that 82% of people were perfectly comfortable with the idea that wildlife possessed intrinsic value, which is probably surprising. But age, gender, income, rural versus urban there was nothing significant in the differences between those two things. So I think we probably fall into comfortable ways of thinking about that. Oh, it's your upbringing, it's your religion. But even if we think about religions, people interpret those in different ways. Any one religion has multiple interpretations of how humans ought to interact with nature. So I don't know if we know fully. We have a lot of anecdotes, right? We tell our own stories, and often our own stories are exposure to nature as young people. But I think there's probably more to the story. There's more social science work I think needs to be done with that. That's not a very satisfying answer, but
no, it was a tough question. No, that's interesting. Thank you.
Not satisfying to me either. If it makes you feel any better.
So we have two questions here. The first is, what is the title of the Anderson book you referenced?
It's something like, actually, that quote is not in his most recent book of poetry. It's something like Haunted Forest, a guide to the enchanted or haunted forest or something like that. It's a beautiful, cool book of poetry, especially for people who are interested in nature. I can't remember the title. I got it for Christmas, but I can dig it up and stick it in the chat.
And then the next one here is, it seems like more and more we hear about people thinking that plants have rights, like human rights. How do we deal with this trend as a profession?
We hug it. We embrace it. I think this is happening all over the world. I'm seeing this more and more. And I'm seeing this from within the scientific realm as well. I'm thinking of, Suzanne Simard's work. I'm thinking of work on mushrooms that I've been reading lately. This willingness to think of the world as more animate, minded, conscious than we have in the past. I'm a little bit bowled over by this trend. This is not a foreign idea in other cultures. It's certainly not a foreign idea in indigenous cultures, but it's you have to go back to before about 585 BC in our culture I guess at that time, the early Greek philosophers were looking for the sacred in nature as well. But that slowly kind of got driven out of our pursuit of trying to understand the way the world worked. But the point is, you got to go back about 2,000 years in our culture before that's a comfortable idea. But it seems to be coming back. This idea that nature has certain qualities that then bestow it rights in the same way that humans are granted rights. I don't see that going away. I think of that as something we need to think about, and how do we build that into the way that we think about how we act with nature? One example is to think about, you could think about harvest in a different way, right? You could think about, Robin Kimmer, a colleague of mine, Robin Kimmer, talks about the notion of an honorable harvest. What does an honorable forest harvest look like? If you start with the idea that you're dealing with morally relevant entities, what does it look like to interact appropriately? How does that change the way that we do it? It doesn't mean we don't do it, but it might mean we do it in a different way. So I think there's some advantages to it unlocks our imagination in a way that that we're currently not thinking about how to interact with the world. So yeah, I think we should hug it.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions. So Michael, thank you again so much for your presentation this morning.
Yeah, thanks to all of you.